They say every old house remembers, not just the laughter and the light, but the hands that mended, the voices that prayed, and the spirits that refused to leave their work undone. When Clara inherits her great-aunt's crumbling cottage at the end of Hemlock Lane, she expects dust, cobwebs and creaking floors, not the quiet figure who appears each evening on the back step, knitting by twilight. But some patterns are older than blood and some guardians never rest. As day fades to dusk, Clara will learn that keeping the world whole may depend on a single steady rhythm. Click, click, click.
They say in the Caribbean, the night never keeps its secrets. Welcome to Caribbean Noir. From whispers in the cane fields to shadows by the sea, these are the folktales they never wanted you to hear.
The house at the end of Hemlock Lane did not so much lean as sigh against the old oak that supported its eastern wall. It was a cottage of weary clapboard and moss-furred shingles, with a chimney that had not coughed smoke in a generation. To Clara, at 27 with a life in boxes and a heart full of city grit, it was perfect. It was an escape. A blank page. The key, heavy and iron, turned with a groan that seemed to come from the house's very bones. The air that rushed out was cold and carried the scent of dried lavender, dust, and the faint, sweet tang of apples long past their prime. Clara stepped over the threshold, her boot heels echoing on white plank pine floors worn smooth and pale by generations of feet. She had inherited the place from a great-aunt she barely remembered, a reclusive woman named Agnes who was said to have known the names of every wildflower in the woods and the secrets of every root in the soil. The interior was a time capsule. Doilies like frozen lace under a thick skin of dust, a grandfather clock whose brass pendulum was stilled in mid-swing, and sepia-toned photographs of unsmiling ancestors staring from the walls with eyes that seemed to follow her. Her first week was a blur of cleaning, of airing out rooms that felt heavy with silence, of unpacking her own meager possessions, books on coding, a sleek laptop, a collection of minimalist art, which looked alien and frivolous in the sturdy hand-hewn space. The only creature that seemed to approve was a tomcat the color of a storm cloud, who appeared on the second day. He had one chewed ear and eyes the color of old amber. He didn't meow, but simply sat on the stone wall bordering the wild, overgrown garden watching her. She started leaving out saucers of milk, which he would lap up with a quiet, dignified air before vanishing back into the twilight. She named him Grimalkin for he seemed a creature of old tales. It was on the fifth evening as the late summer sun began to bleed into the horizon, that Clara first saw the other resident. She was washing her few dishes at the deep porcelain sink, looking out the window that faced the back of the property. The garden was a riot of neglect. Rose bushes had grown into thorny thickets, hollyhocks stood like sentinels with faded, papery blooms, and a gnarled apple tree, heavy with small, hard fruit, dominated the center. And there, nestled against the back of the house under the eaves of a small woodshed, was a simple wooden step. On that step a woman sat. Clara's breath fogged the cool glass. The woman was small, swaddled in layers of wool despite the mild evening. A thick, gray-knitted scarf was wrapped around her head and neck, and a heavy, dark shawl was draped over her stooped shoulders. In her lap was a bundle of yarn the color of cream, and in her hands, 2 long knitting needles clicked and flashed silver in the fading light. She worked with a rhythmic, hypnotic certainty, her fingers a blur of practiced motion. She looked for all the world like a sweet old granny, a picture postcard of rural tranquility. A warmth spread in Clara's chest. A neighbor, perhaps? Someone who had known Aunt Agnes? She felt a sudden, sharp longing for connection, for a voice other than her own or the tinny one from her podcast headphones. Drying her hands on her jeans, she walked to the back door, a heavy thing of oak and iron bolts. She wrestled the top bolt loose, its screech unnaturally loud in the quiet. She stepped out onto the flagstone path. The air was cooler here, smelling of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine. "Hello," Clara called, her voice softer than she intended, swallowed by the immense quiet. The clicking of the needles stopped. The figure on the step did not turn, but her head tilted slightly as if listening to a distant sound. Emboldened, Clara took a few steps closer. "Lovely evening, isn't it? I'm Clara. I've just moved in." The granny's shoulders shifted. Slowly, with a stiffness that spoke of great age, she began to turn. The knitting settled in her lap. The scarf, wrapped high around her head, obscured most of her face, leaving only a hint of a wrinkled cheek and the soft, drooping lid of one eye in shadow. "I was wondering if you knew my great-aunt Agnes?" Clara asked, now just 10 feet away. At the name Agnes, the figure went perfectly still. Then, with a deliberate, unnerving slowness, she lifted her face fully towards Clara. The scarf slipped back just an inch. Where a nose should have been, there was only a dark, triangular cavity. The skin around it was not wrinkled but desiccated, pulled taut like old parchment over a stark, bony structure. The single visible eye was not a soft, milky orb of age, but a deep, empty socket, dark as a well and swarming with tiny, glinting spiders that skittered across its bony rim. Clara's breath hitched in her throat, a strangled gasp that made no sound. Her brain refused to process the image. It was a mask. A trick of the light. A Halloween prop. The granny's hands, which had been resting on her knitting, rose. They were clad in fingerless wool gloves, but the flesh that was visible was gray and withered, the nails long and yellowed. They went to the scarf and began to slowly, patiently unwind it. Loop by loop, the gray wool fell away, revealing the truth beneath. It was a skull. Not a clean white laboratory specimen, but an ancient yellowed cranium, stained with time and earth. A few wisps of brittle white hair clung to its crown. The jawbone was intact, hinged and capable of movement. In the deep, shadowed hollow of the eyes, more of the tiny spiders moved, weaving minute silvery webs from the supraorbital ridge to the zygomatic arch. A faint, phosphorescent moss grew in the fissures of the parietal bone, emitting a soft, sickly green glow. The skull tilted. The jaw, unhinging with a faint, dry click, dropped open. From within that dark cavern where a tongue should have been, a large black moth emerged, its wings velvety and dusted with iridescent blue spots. It fluttered once, twice, then flew past Clara's frozen face, its passage silent. Clara did not scream. A profound, primal cold had seized her, locking her muscles and freezing the air in her lungs. She took one stumbling step back, then another. The granny spirit made no move to follow. She simply sat, her bony face lifted to the dusk, the empty sockets fixed on Clara. Then, with the same deliberate care, she began to rewrap the scarf around her skull, concealing the horror, returning to the illusion of the sweet old woman. Her hands dropped back to her lap, picked up the needles, and the soft, rhythmic click-click-click began again. Clara fled. She scrambled back into the house, slamming the heavy door and throwing the bolts with trembling, fumbling hands. She leaned against it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She spent the night huddled on the sofa in the front parlor, every creak of the old house sending a fresh jolt of terror through her. Grimalkin did not appear. The next morning, in the clear, rational light of day, Clara tried to convince herself it had been a waking dream. A stress-induced hallucination. The product of an overactive imagination fueled by the isolation and the strange history of the house. She drank strong coffee and stared out the kitchen window. The back step was empty, save for a few fallen oak leaves. But that evening, as the sun once again began to dip below the tree line, casting long, distorted shadows across the garden, the granny was there. Same steps, same posture, same hypnotic knitting. Clara's blood ran cold. She stood at the window, hidden by the curtain, and watched. The granny never varied her rhythm. She was a fixture, as much a part of the dusk as the rising of the first evening star. For a week, Clara lived in a state of heightened dread. She finished her unpacking by day and barricaded herself in the house by night, the back door bolted and a chair shoved under the knob for good measure. She stopped going into the kitchen after 4 o'clock. The cheerful, modern world of her laptop felt a million miles away. Yet the granny never approached the house. She never looked towards the window. Simply was. Curiosity, that most human and most dangerous of instincts, began to prickle at the edges of Clara's fear. What was she? A ghost? A guardian? A warning? The sheer, bizarre specificity of her, the knitting, the step, the skull, suggested a purpose, a ritual. On the 8th evening, clutching a mug of tea she didn't want, Clara ventured back to the kitchen window. The granny was there, clicking in the deepening blue. Grimalkin was there too. He was sitting on the flagstone path, a respectful distance from the step, washing one paw with fastidious care. He showed no fear. He would occasionally pause his ablutions, his amber eyes regarding the knitting figure with what seemed like a placid ancient understanding. This, more than anything, calmed Clara's racing heart. The cat, a creature of pure instinct, was not afraid. The following day she drove into the small, sleepy town of Oakhaven. The library was a small, Carnegie-built building smelling of old paper and polish. The librarian, a woman with kind eyes and a nameplate that read Beatrice, was eager to help when Clara mentioned she was researching her family, the Hargraves, at the old house on Hemlock Lane. Agnes Hargrave, Beatrice said, her voice hushed with a sort of reverence. She was the last of the main line. A remarkable woman. Knew all the old ways. Some folks called her a witch, but not in a mean way. More like a wise woman. Beatrice helped her find old town records, census data, and a crumbling leather-bound history of the county. Clara spent hours poring over the spidery script. She learned that the Hargraves had lived on that land since the town's founding in the late 1600s. They were farmers, woodsmen, and in several cases, noted herbalists and midwives. It was in a box of unsorted documents in the attic archive that Clara found the first real clue, a small handmade book, its pages filled with Agnes's own tight, looping handwriting. It was not a diary but a ledger of sorts. Lists of herbs and their uses, sketches of plants, notes on the weather. And then an entry that made Clara's skin prickle. October 3rd. The veil thins. Sat with mother on the back step. He taught me the stitch for binding, the one that mends what is torn. The yarn is the breath, the needle is the bone. We must keep the work going. Always. Mother. Clara's great-grandmother. Another entry a few pages later was more cryptic. The guardian grows weary. The patterns are harder to hold. The unraveling whispers at the edges of the wood. I fear I will be the last who knows the work. Clara left the library with her head spinning. The veil. The guardian. The unraveling. It was the language of folklore, of superstition. But it was also the language her own flesh and blood had spoken. That evening she didn't hide. She stood at the open back door, the screen between her and the garden, and watched the granny knit. The clicking needles no longer sounded like a simple craft. They sounded like a chant, a ward, a constant rhythmic assertion of order against chaos. Days turned into weeks. Autumn began to paint the maple trees in fiery hues. Clara's fear gradually morphed into a solemn, watchful acceptance. The granny, the guardian, was part of the house, part of the land. Her presence was not malevolent, but functional. Grimalkin was her constant companion at dusk, a silent acolyte. One night a fierce storm rolled in from the west. The wind howled around the cottage, rattling the windows and moaning in the chimney. Rain lashed the walls in horizontal sheets. Clara, checking for leaks, passed the kitchen window and gasped. The granny was still there. She sat on the back step, hunched against the weather, her shawl soaked black and clinging to her skeletal frame. The rain poured over her scarf-wrapped head, dripping from the bony protrusion of her chin. But her hands never stopped. The needles clicked on, a sound swallowed by the storm's roar but visible in their relentless motion. She was a rock against a torrent, a lighthouse in a gale. And huddled at her feet, sheltered by the overhang of her body and the woodshed's eave, was Grimalkin, dry and unperturbed. In that moment any last vestige of Clara's fear vanished, replaced by a surge of profound, aching respect. This was not a monster. This was a sentry standing her post through eternity. The next evening the air was clean and cold. Clara, acting on an impulse she didn't fully understand, took the old woolen blanket from Agnes's rocking chair and went to the back door. She stepped outside. The granny was in her usual place, the dampness of the previous night seemingly already forgotten. Grimalkin watched Clara approach, his tail giving a single slow twitch. Clara stopped a few feet from the step. She could smell the old wool, damp earth, and that faint, sweet scent of apples. She did not look at the scarf, at the hidden face. She kept her eyes on the busy, knitting hands. It's cold tonight, Clara said, her voice steady. I thought you might. I brought a blanket. She knelt, her knees pressing into the cold, damp flagstones, and carefully draped the blanket over the granny's lap, over the knitting. The needles never paused. The rhythm didn't falter. But for a single heart-stopping second, one of the gloved, skeletal hands lifted from the yarn and rested briefly on top of Clara's. The touch was light as a dried leaf, cold as a stone in winter, but it carried no malice. Felt like an acknowledgement. Thanks. A single withered oak leaf caught in the wind, drifted down and landed on the blanket. The granny's hand returned to its work. Clara stood and went back inside, her heart full of a strange, quiet peace. She had been acknowledged. He was now part of the story. Winter came early, laying a thick blanket of snow over Hemlock Lane. The granny still came, sitting on the cleared step, a silent, dark shape against the pristine white. Her knitting continued, the cream-colored yarn seeming to glow in the twilight. Clara would often sit at the kitchen table with her own tea, watching. She had started to learn to knit from a book she'd found in Agnes's trunk, her own clumsy, slow clicks a faint, echoing answer to the relentless, perfect rhythm outside. One evening in deep winter something changed. Clara was watching as usual when the granny's hands suddenly stilled. The clicking stopped. The silence was more terrifying than any storm. The granny's head, scarf and all, drooped forward. One of the knitting needles slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the stone step. Grimalkin, who had been sleeping at her feet, immediately stood up, his back arched, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He was not looking at the granny, but past her into the dark, tangled depths of the woods beyond the garden. Claire felt it too. A pressure drop. A sudden, invasive cold that had nothing to do with the weather. The air grew thick and a new sound emerged from the woods. A soft, sibilant whispering, like 1,000 dry leaves skittering across ice. It was the sound of things coming apart. The unraveling. The granny's body trembled. She tried to reach for the fallen needle, but her movements were feeble, slow. The whispering from the woods grew louder, more insistent. The shadows at the tree line seemed to deepen and writhe, stretching long, tendril-like fingers towards the garden. Claire didn't think. She threw open the back door and ran out into the snow. The cold bit through her socks. She ignored it. She knelt on the step, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and picked up the fallen knitting needle. It was colder than ice, and holding it sent a jolt through her system, a shock of memory that was not her own. Images of other hands, other winters, a lineage of women sitting on this very step. She pressed the needle back into the granny's gloved hand. The granny's head lifted. The scarf had shifted, and Clara found herself staring directly into the left eye socket. The spiders within were frantic, scrambling over one another. The phosphorescent moss pulsed with a weak, faltering light. But deep within that darkness, for a fleeting second, Clara saw not emptiness, but a flicker of something else. An intelligence, a plea, a profound and ancient weariness. The whispering was at the edge of the garden now. The rose bushes trembled, their thorns seeming to grow longer, sharper. The world felt thin like fabric stretched to tearing. The granny's hands closed around the needles, but they were shaking too violently to resume their work. No, Clara whispered. She reached out. She placed her own warm, living hands over the granny's cold, dead ones. She guided them. Together they pushed one needle through a loop of yarn, then the other. A single clumsy joint stitch. The sound was small, but it cut through the whispering like a shard of glass. They made another stitch. Clara's warmth flowed into the cold bones, and the granny's trembling began to subside. The rhythm returned, stronger now, steadier. It was no longer just the granny's rhythm. It was their rhythm. A new pattern. Clara kept her hands over the granny's, their 4 hands moving as one, the living and the dead, knitting against the coming dark. The whispering receded, hissing in frustration. The invasive cold withdrew. The shadows shrunk back to their proper places under the trees. The world's fabric tightened, becoming whole and solid once more. They knitted together until the last of the light was gone from the sky and the moon rose, a silver coin in the black velvet night. Finally, the granny's hands stilled, the work complete for another evening. Clara slowly removed her hands. They were stiff and cold, but a strange power hummed in her veins. The granny turned her skull towards Clara. Slowly, deliberately, she reached up with one gloved hand and pulled the scarf down, just enough to reveal the lipless line of her jaw. The jawbone worked, and from within a single, perfect, cream-colored moth emerged. It fluttered once around Clara's head, its wings brushing her cheek with the softness of a blessing, then flew off into the night. The granny rewrapped her scarf, gathered her knitting and stood. For the first time she did not simply fade or remain seated. She turned and walked, not with a ghostly glide, but with the solid, heavy step of the earth itself, around the corner of the woodshed and was gone. Grimalkin rubbed against Clara's legs, purring like a small engine. Clara sat on the back step for a long time, looking out at the quiet, moonlit garden. The step was just a step. The garden was just a garden. But she knew now that she was not just the owner of a house. She was the keeper of a threshold, the student of a spirit. The work would continue. And when the next dusk fell, she would be there, her own knitting in her lap, sitting beside the granny spirit on the back step, ensuring that the stitches held and the world remained mended. The old house on Hemlock Lane still stands, its walls whispering in the wind and its back step brushed clean by time. Some evenings, when the veil grows thin and the air hums with memory, a soft click-click-click can still be heard beneath the apple tree. They say it's the granny spirit, keeping her eternal vigil. Others say it's Clara, carrying on the work, one stitch at a time, ensuring the world never comes undone. Either way, the knitting never stops.
This was Caribbean Noir, where shadows hold the truth, and every island has a secret.